Last night I saw this 4chan thread in regards to Baldur's Gate 3. Like, oh, did you know that Baldur's Gate 3 beat Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom? And it's interesting looking back on this because first of all, Tears of the Kingdom did win more Game of the Year awards than Baldur's Gate 3 did. It did sell more, it was more successful, and it is getting a follow-up this year. It Echoes of Wisdom, right? Zelda was more successful than Baldur's Gate 3 by every metric, right? But people really do want to cling on to Baldur's Gate 3. They really want to fool people into thinking this game was some kind of phenomenon and it was super successful. And they want to do that to weaponize it against Zelda because I've always seen this. Whenever people like bring up like Baldur's Gate 3, it's always in association with like the Game Awards thing. It's always in association with like Zelda, right? They don't talk down to Spider-Man 2, they don't talk down to Starfield or Hogwarts Legacy. They are specifically targeting Zelda. And this is the typical tactic used by astroturfing shills is just focusing on the game that people actually like, the game that people actually play, and then they're just like, oh, that sucks actually, and then they just try and like keep their own irrelevant game talked about, right? It happened with Horizon Zero Dawn in 2017, and it took years and years before people started seeing through the franchise and realizing that like it was entirely astroturfed, right? It took like a VR spin-off and a sequel for people to start realizing that like wait, nobody really cares about this Aloy's game, right? Like it's not that big of a deal. Like again, people forget this, but I remember what it was like in 2017, in that period when Breath of the Wild first came out, where people were like bending over backwards trying to tell you that like Horizon Zero Dawn is better. Like Nier Automata is better. Yakuza Zero is better. Like stop talking about Zelda, guys. Stop buying Switches, guys. Like I remember what that was like. And then Tears of the Kingdom comes out, like years and years later, and they did the typical Zelda cycle thing, where they pretend Breath of the Wild was good for like 10 hours, and then like say that like Tears of the Kingdom like disappointed me. Oh, like they tried doing that thing, right? They tried pushing that narrative, and it just falls completely flat, right? Because like Baldur's Gate 3 and Tears of the Kingdom, at the very least, they are completely different games, right? Like, they are completely different genres, and it is safe to say that, like, Tears of the Kingdom is a far more mainstream, relevant game than Baldur's Gate 3, which is part of a niche genre that nobody cares about, right? Nobody cares about CRPGs. Nobody. And yet we're supposed to believe that like, oh, this one is different though. It's innovated on the genre. Like everyone I've talked to says it doesn't play any differently than like Divinity Original Sin 2, right? Like what exactly is supposed to make Baldur's Gate 3 the game of the year 2023? All anybody can do is just screech about the Game Awards and try to tell you that like Tears of the Kingdom wasn't that great when like Tears of the Kingdom isn't the only game that came out in 2023, right? Like I have a hard time believing Baldur's Gate 3 is even better than Elden Ring, to be completely honest with you. Like I haven't played Baldur's Gate 3 yet, but like now that I've started looking at like gameplay footage and like seeing what the game is actually like I see a slow, boring mess, right? That's probably wouldn't be able to be competitive with Fire Emblem. Like, is my honest opinion, right? Like, why exactly would I get fired up over like a mediocre Western developed CRPG? Like, why exactly am I supposed to be excited for this? Right? Because it's the new shiny thing? Like, no, I have never seen any reason to get into Baldur's Gate 3, right? Nobody has ever done a good job, like telling me, like explaining to me what makes the game good. It's always just like, oh, it's the best game ever made. Okay, why? Cause like you make decisions and stuff. I remember when people said the same thing about Mass Effect, and look where that ended up, right? It is to me appalling just how many people make these gigantic, ridiculous statements with the intent of like specifically downplaying Nintendo releases, right? Like it isn't just about Baldur's Gate 3 versus Tears of the Kingdom. It's like everything against Nintendo, right? You know, Like, it has been obnoxious this year in particular, seeing how like Power World was artificially propped up to try and dismantle the Pokemon IP, right? It was clearly like set up for that to happen, but to do that, they would have to like dethrone like the biggest media property in the world, right? Like again, like a real problem that like the gaming establishment is happening right now is that like Pokemon's core audience are too young to consume gaming media and often don't know that like there's any controversy about like upcoming Pokemon releases at all, right? Like again, Scarlet and Violet was like wildly hated upon release, and like what happens? It becomes like some of the best. They become the best-selling games on Switch, right? So did Sword and Shield, right? Like the attempts at subverting and destroying Pokemon have like completely failed, and attempts like paltry, pathetic attempts like Power World are just falling flat on their face, right? Like, and Baldur's Gate 3 is the same way, right? Like, you can't take something like Baldur's Gate 3, throw it against Zelda, and expect it to win, right? Like, I would not be surprised that when the Zelda movie comes out, that it outperforms Lord of the Rings, right? That it outperforms like all those terrible D&D movies, right? That it becomes like the most widely acclaimed like video game adaptation ever, right? And people are going to be in denial about it, right? Just like they were about the Super Mario Bros. Movie, right? How many people like tried to push this idea The Last of Us was like some amazing masterpiece, like cinematic masterpiece, when in reality it didn't do as well or was as well made or interesting as the Super Mario Bros. Movie, right? Like people downplayed the Mario movie to try to keep up the facade that like the really good video game adaptations were like the Castlevania one or the Sonic one, right? They used everything they possibly could to try to keep the discussion away from Nintendo, to try to keep people from noticing that like the Nintendo brand was better. And they're going to do the same thing with Zelda. And I'm really curious just like how they're going to do it, right? I'm really curious what they're going to do with the Zelda movie when that comes out. It's going to be interesting to see, but it is doomed to failure. I think is the way to put this. Because like even in the mid 2000s, when like I would say people actually took like the criticisms towards Zelda seriously, like even back then, people were like acknowledging that like Ocarina of Time was one of the best games ever made, right? You know, they were attacking like Majora's and Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, but like they had to admit that Ocarina of Time was good, right? And now in 2024, people have to admit that Twilight Princess was good, that Wind Waker was good, that Majora's Mask was good. Like making fun of Majora's Mask in 2024 would just get you laughed at, right? That is the situation we're in today. Is that all of the narratives that they threw against Zelda have just completely collapsed. Tears of the Kingdom is going to be a well remembered, popular game 10, 20 years from now, long after Baldur's Gate 3 is completely forgotten.